Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. We do so by painting an accurate picture of that journey from the perspective of the justice-involved individual. Too often, our perceptions of those individuals are tainted by media-driven caricatures created to sell newspapers or movie tickets. This adds little to a healthy dialogue as to how to best address criminality and the reintegration process. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please, welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 81 of the Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. I was so thrilled when my next guest agreed to be on the program. If you work under the risk, need, responsivity framework, you are really going to enjoy this episode as well. Brian Lovins is the former Assistant Director of Harris County Community Supervision and Corrections Department. Prior to that, Brian was the Associate Director of UCCI, the University of Cincinnati's Corrections Institute. University of Cincinnati is also where Brian earned his PhD in criminology. He is currently a principal for Justice System Partners. In 2020, Brian received the Ed Latessa Practitioner Research Award from the American Society of Criminology for his continued work in helping community corrections move forward. He was also honored with the Dr. Simon Denitz Award by the Ohio Community Corrections Association and the David Dillingham Public Service Award from ICCA, the International Community Corrections Association. He has been published a variety of times. His publications include articles on risk assessment, sexual offenders, effective interventions, probation reform, and cognitive behavioral interventions. I am so glad I'm able to share my conversation with Dr. Lovins with you all. I sincerely hope you enjoy listening to this interview as much as I had conducting it. Please enjoy my fascinating chat with Dr. Brian Lovins, and I will see you all on the other side. Well, welcome to the show, Dr. Lovins. So glad to have you here. Why don't we start out by you telling us, just generally speaking, a little bit about yourself for the listeners out there who may not be as familiar with your work as I am.
No, thank you. And thanks for the invitation. I'm super excited to be on the podcast. A long round of people before me that are much more knowledgeable. So thank you and look forward to the conversation. So I'm currently a principal at Justice System Partners. We're a small non-for-profit criminal justice research reform agency. Prior to that, I worked in the field for 10 years as a assistant director at Harris County. Before that, as a social worker. And so I was a social worker. I worked in a range of programs that served both adult and juvenile individuals that were justice involved. So ranging from like people who've engaged in sex offenses to use of violence, intimate partner violence, residential substance use. So a pretty broad array of experiences working in the field directly with people that are justice involved, and then through the university, and then most recently through Harris.
So many folks in corrections, particularly those who are familiar with evidence-based practices, are aware of the University of Cincinnati's Corrections Institute, or UCCI. And you just sort of referenced a little bit of this, but so you got your degree from the University of Cincinnati. You worked in the field for around 10 years, went back to get your PhD. Tell us about what it was like working at UCCI, because again, a lot of folks are aware of their work, that those deliverables they put out around training evidence-based practices. What was that community like, for lack of a better term, or that experience?
Yeah, no, great question. I think my experience, and if I can take a step back real quick, really coming with a social work degree, right? So I think a lot of folks in criminal justice, especially people with PhDs, tended to, what I found was, especially at UC, came through the ranks of criminal justice or criminology, right? So they grew up in and the PhD folks generally didn't have a lot of applied work experience, but they got an undergrad in criminal justice, generally a master's, and then a PhD. And so my experience was a little different. I'd come into the university after working 10 years as a social worker. So I was a social worker by training. I had an MSW actually from the University of Cincinnati as well. And so I think it informed my practice at UC and opened the door to a uniquely different experience. So our work, both my wife has a PhD and went through the program as well. So our work in the field sort of colored our experience and changed the Corrections Institute. So prior to us coming on, and not that we were the reason for this, I think we were the beneficiary of it. So Ed Latessa, as most of you all know, was sort of the director of the Corrections Institute and sort of led the charge over the last 20 years around the practical application of academia, right? And so he really is the sort of, I would argue, is one of the grandfathers of like bringing academics to the community, right? And a great job of translating research into practice. And so when I started, we did LSI trainings, right? So UCCI was predominantly LSI trainings, and we did some CPAI, core correctional practice, or some correctional program checklist evaluation stuff, really limited stuff at that time. And so what we started to expand out on was the delivery of what now is considered core correctional practices. Back then, we called it the cognitive behavioral interventions for correctional workers. And we worked with both probation, parole, prison. And it was a really cool environment. It was one of those places where the symbiotic relationship between, we had some academics at the table, we had people that were working on their PhDs, like Chris Lowenkamp and Jennifer Peeler and Debbie Schaefer at the time, Tetzel Schaefer. And so we had this group of people who sort of had this nice blended model of field and experience, but also this academic rigor under Ed with let's be honest, if you know Ed, like a no BS kind of approach, right? Like you call it as you see it. I remember Ed saying at one point in time, like, I don't really care what the subject is. If research showed us that standing on your head in a corner would change behavior, that's what I would be up here talking about. And I think having that really practical experience and so for Lori and I, bringing that to the table with us of working in agencies for 10 years as social workers really opened the door to have a unique experience with UCCI.
Yeah, you rattle off those names, and again, that's sort of a who's who of EBP rock stars for those of us. So that's why I asked. That must have been just such a fun experience to be a part of that. You co-authored a fantastic article for Federal Probation Journal entitled "Probation Officer as Coach: Building a New Professional Identity." A great read. As soon as I read that, I was forwarding it as fast as I could to all of my colleagues and training peers. Walk us through, just kind of maybe broadly talk about your thoughts as to the evolution of that role of probation officer, and we'll do a deeper dive on some of the themes as well. But generally speaking, what was that like?
Well, it's good to find out that you were the other person than my mom to read the article. So I was always looking for the second person to never really tie them down. So I really appreciate that.
Trust me, it was more than your mother and I.
That's good to know, because my mom probably didn't read it. She just told me she did. So, No, I think it was, that article was born out of probably 6-7 years, right? So we've got to go back to UCCI days. And so I was finishing up my PhD and trying to decide, like, where do I want to go? I was never an academician. I knew that I never wanted, or my goal was never to be a faculty at a university. I'm too applied. The university space is not applied enough for me, although at UCCI, Ed had kind of dug out this space where people could be practical. Most universities write for academics. They think for academics and they produce for academics. And I always felt myself as more practitioner first, researcher second. Not that I was not academically curious, but I have more applied aspirations. I want to change the world. I want to change the practices that happen. And I see that through the day-to-day operations of organizations from within the tent, and not from an academic perspective of creating teachers or professors who then do the work, right? So as I got done with my PhD at UC, I was looking for an applied space where, for all my experience in corrections and correctional populations, I never worked in probation and parole, which I think is somewhat surprising to folks, given that I was this assistant director of the third largest probation department in the country, and now the president of the American Probation Parole Association, but I was never a probation or parole officer. I think that speaks volumes, though, to my ability to sort of transcend or translate material so that it feels like it's part of the fabric of what we do. And so I left UC with the intentions to better understand how to operationalize probation, right? We recognize that about 4.5 million people are on probation at any given time of the year. A lot of people are touched in their lives through probation. And so an incredible opportunity to rethink how probation works. And the reality is, I think you can't fix something until you understand. And there's some things, I guess, you can have this theoretical view and sort of top down, but I really believe you had to stand in the center of it and figure out, like, what does this really mean? And what does evidence-based practice mean? And what does core correctional practice? And how do you implement in a space where it necessarily wasn't designed for that, right? And so I went to Harris. Worked for Dr. Teresa May in Harris County, a great visionary boss. I called her at one point and said, "Look, I know you're getting ready to hire me. I just want to let you know that I've never worked in probation, and you're getting ready to hire me as assistant director." And she said, "That's why I'm hiring, because I want fresh ideas and fresh perspective of the work we do." And so from there, it really was this, like, digging into people. And I'll be honest, like, when I got there, I wasn't sure about probation and parole officers. Like, I wasn't sure that and I'd known Vinny a little bit, Vinny Shirelli, but like, I didn't know him real well. I've had many conversations since then with him. And he would refer to, later in the years, probation and parole officers as blue-collar bureaucrats or lunch pail bureaucrats, is what he calls them, right? You bring your lunch today to work, and your job is to kind of move through the bureaucracy. And to be honest, if he would have introduced that to me in 2013, I probably would have bought into it. I probably would have been like, yeah, that's sort of the feel. But when I got there, I found people that were incredibly excited about their work. They really were change agents. They were people who wanted to help people get better. They may have had a different path or a different way. It may not have been core correctional practice or evidence-based practice. But even the toughest probation officers I met, the most hard-ass ones that sort of nail them, trail them, jail them kind of, or trail them, nail them, jail them kind of perspective, did it in an effort to change behavior or to protect the community. And so I started thinking about that. I started thinking about, like, how does this work? Like, how do we actually define what a probation or parole officer or community supervision officer does? And so I started, like any good researcher, which I would argue is, by nature who I really am, I started reading, and I read, Faye Taxman had a bunch of articles out on sort of organizing probation. You have a historical look from the 60s about trying to classify probation officers. You have this social work law enforcement model. You have this synthetic model that sort of produces these sort of like unclear how, but some way of these 9 matrices into this single event. And I started thinking about it, and I started talking to people, and really where it was born out of was being frustrated that staff were not engaged or did not want to deliver reinforcers. I'm like, what would block people from wanting to reinforce behavior? Right? It's a core correctional practice. It's one of the center pins to how you get behavioral change. Yet probation officer after probation officer, I talk to them like, look, I'm not here to say good job. I'm here to monitor, make sure they do what they're supposed to do. The benefit of being on probation is that you're not in prison, and that's really that's the reinforcer. And I started thinking, I'm like, why in the world would we not use and they were adamant that they weren't going to reinforce people on supervision. I started thinking about it. I'm like, you know what? It's because they're referees. And think about what a referee is, right? A referee is a non-emotional connected person to a system that maintains behavior, right? And it keeps people in the bounds. They blow the whistle, they monitor, they look for rule breaking. And what do referees do when they see a great play? Lucky for us, they ignore it, right? Could imagine, right? I'm watching the World Series last night, and Freeman hits that home run to go up 6-5. I can only imagine the home run, the home umpire sitting there waiting for him to get to the home base and high fiving him. It's like the crowd would be going crazy, but the Houston fans would have been going nuts, right? What kind of crap is this? And so I started thinking about it. I'm like, you know what? The way that probation and parole have been operationalized over the course of especially the last 30 years with the get tough on crime kind of movement is that when you boil it down, conditions are set, or probation rules or parole rules, however you want to look at them, they're set. The officer from day one starts looking for failure of them, recording it, and ultimately reporting it out. And it's rinse, repeat. And it's continuing to bring them back. And what our goal is in that, I believe, is to do exactly what a referee does on a field, which is to get compliance. We're going to keep monitoring you and look at all these interventions, the HOPE model, smart punishment. All these interventions are can we punish people smarter? Can we use deterrence models? Can we figure out how the right level of punishment, the right timing of it, and the right dosage of it? And it's all of those things are problematic when we start to think about the fact that we know that punishment stops behavior, but it doesn't replace it with something new. So and I know we'll get a little bit deeper in the analogy of the sports stuff, but my analogy often is, right, if I have a left tackle in football who keeps holding the person in front of them because they can't stop, they don't have the talent to stop the person from rushing the quarterback, and my job is to protect the quarterback, and so if I have to, I'm going to hold and try to get away with it. If I keep getting the whistle blown, if I'm a coach, my job would be to teach him a technique that can get him through the game to be successful. If I'm a referee, my job isn't to say, hey, look, you keep holding the guy. Let me show you a move so that you don't have to hold him anymore, or call a different play in a different direction so that the left tackle doesn't ruin the game. A referee just blows the whistle and they'll just keep calling a hold as long as they hold them. And so that was really where it was born out of, was this idea that staff didn't want to reinforce people.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of analogies, and I love sports as well. So that really resonated with me as a former probation officer. I'm more in a training role now, but you're right. You nailed it on the head with that analogy of just sort of monitoring those terms and conditions, that of a referee, and not that of a coach / change agent, etc. I will leave a link in the show notes of this episode to that federal probation article for individuals besides myself and your mother to access that article, Brian.
Fair enough. She will watch this podcast or listen to this podcast too. I've taught her about podcasts, so don't worry.
All right. Well, then I'll have a listener besides my mother. I'll have my mother and your mother listening to this podcast. Were there any other experiences from that paper or feedback you get or anything you want to share?
Yeah, I think there's a couple really fundamental pieces, right? The first one is how coaches and referees, who they work for, right? Because I think this is a fundamental concept because people are like, oh, you're just repackaging law enforcement social worker hat. And I'm like, no, you're not. Because a coach works for the team. But let's start with the ref. The ref doesn't work for a single team. They work for the league, the system. Their job is to maintain status quo of the system. And a coach works for a team, which means that they're winning and losing. Their job is to get the best out of their players. And I really believe that as we start to adopt these core correctional practices and more informed practices within our field, and we become more around our expectations are more about change agents. If we want to make a difference, if we want to meet our metrics, if we want to meet our funding, the county's requirements for funding or the state's funding requirements, that we're going to change people's behavior, we have to change the professional narrative that we're using. And that our job is not to enforce the rules of the court. Our job is to take the rules of the court, just like a football game or a baseball game, and teach the players how to do the best they can with those rules. And a coach does that. And a coach is invested in the players and the outcome. And I ask people all the time, and this is my analogy to help them see it, or my example, is I say, what's your win-loss record as a probation officer? And they got no idea. They're like, I don't. I'm like, I bet you know how many contacts you had this month and whether you made your contacts or not. I bet you know how many drug tests you've given, or you can find those out, and you can find the outcome of the drug test pretty easily in your studies or in your case management system. But you can't find your win-loss record. And I say to them, I say, what's a ref's win-loss record? You can find how many flags they threw. Mm-hmm. You can find out how many whistles they blew. At the end of the game, they'll say the number of penalty yards that the team got in football. But you don't get their win-loss record because refs don't have win-loss records. Coaches do. And so I think that's my first fundamental piece, that when people say, well, I'm a coach, or this is just repackaging law enforcement social worker, I say no. Ultimately, it's changing the perspective of our job. And I was just talking, I'll leave the county out or the state out, but I was just doing some online training the other day, and a woman raised her hand on the virtual kind of thing. I said, yeah, I called on her, and she said, look, this sounds great. We all would love to be coaches, but at the end of the day, we're officers of the court. We're not coaches of the client. And I said, exactly. That's the problem, is that we defined ourselves as officers of the court, and that our job is to implement the contract between person on supervision and the court. And the reality is that contract is do this, do this, do this, do this, do this. And my job is to make sure you do it. And that means just blowing the whistle. And so I said 100%. And I turned to her boss and said, look, this is what we're talking about. We've got to change the infrastructure in which how we operate, even to think about ourselves as the person on supervision is the one we're invested in to change. And then we get community safety. And I tell people all the time, think about what you do. You write a revocation, you write a law violation after they've already committed the crime. The only thing that we're doing is getting them a quicker warrant to court. They committed a crime. They're going to get arrested by law enforcement and put in jail anyway. So we're not doing anything except for speeding the process up. If we want to be beneficial and fall beyond law enforcement, what we have to do is actually engage people in a different way so that they don't commit the crime, not revoke them after they've committed the crime.
I could not agree more. And to your point, I think the field is really going through sort of a metamorphosis, if you will. We talk about role clarification a lot, thanks to Chris Trotter, but it's sort of like we're going through a vocational role clarification. As like you said, not this enforcement first, rehabilitation later. I won't age myself by saying how old, but when I started my career back in the late 80s, I still have some of those paper resumes lying around. And when I look at the bullet points, it literally says the first or second bullet point, monitor conditions for the court, words to the effect of file probation violations. And now I find myself training and telling folks the opposite. The probation officers who fix it on that, they have the worst results. But here I was 30 years ago saying that's what I do. I'm an officer of the court, and I just report infractions back to the court. Yeah, it's just amazing.
Yeah, I think and I think that's the point, right? It's like our professional identity, and so we talk about this in the article that the social psychologists call this the professional narrative, right? Like our professional identity is associated with this concept of officer or ref, and it's like we have to shift it. And so in the article, we actually presented at the end, and it's an interesting story. So we had a whole section on officer as coach, and basically said, look, and I know in your podcast you talk about stigma and language and alike. The same thing. We said, look, you can't really change the field unless you change the title. Like people, if we continue to maintain this concept of probation officer, we're always going to maintain this law enforcement type mechanism that's, catch people and arrest them. And so we recommended probation coach or coach, right? Of some sort of, but at the time it was probation coach. And the editor actually said, they think that language may be a little too forward thinking at times. Like we need to slow this down a little bit, let people marinate. And we basically pushed back and said, okay, we'll take some of the, it must be that way out. But our last paragraph was, let's imagine ourselves as probation coaches and what that would do to the field or what that would do to our profession. Because I really believe that it's not, right? And when we talk about this, I think it's so true. Like, it's not the skills, right? Like, it's not, because if you look at core correctional practice, you've trained tons of people on risk assessment, implementation, and skill, role play, role modeling, clarification, right? All of those things. The truth is, you can have all of those things and be a ref. Like, I could use a risk assessment and be a ref. I'm going to identify which people are high risk, and then monitor closely the high risk people to catch them failing. As a coach, I use an assessment, right? I take the word risk out. I use a talent assessment, which includes characteristics of whether someone's going to reoffend or not. But I also look at them and say, what is it? What can I grow them in? What can I build them in? What skills do they have that I can continue to help them navigate and use so that they can be successful at their job or at their role or their person or whatever they want? And that, I believe, the language change from ref to coach or from officer to coach transforms us into a different person from our perspective, but also from the person on the supervision. Imagine if I meet with someone and I say, look, my job here is to help you be successful. I'm your coach. And we're going to put together a success plan that we're going to work on over the next 2 years because, to be honest, I'm invested in you. Like, I got to figure out like how I can best understand what's going on and what makes you click so that I can help you figure out how you can be successful at your one. Versus our normal conversation, which is here's the conditions of probation that the judge ordered. My job is to monitor that and help you through it. But at the end of the day, I work for the court and I'm going to report back your compliance and your non-compliance of that. The first brings hope. The second one brings like hopelessness.
Hold that thought regarding hope, because I'm going to ask you a desistance-related question in a moment here, but I'm going to get a little bit tangential on myself when you were speaking. I had a thesis or a theory, if you will, regarding the pandemic that because probation officers, again, due to all the pandemic-related things, they were prohibited, I would contend, in doing a lot of those traditional things that were in their comfort zone, such as, I need you to report for this drug test, or I'm going to make an unannounced field visit on a Saturday night because I think that might steer you out of the criminal justice system or the like. But it forced individuals, particularly if they were limited to, say, a telephone call or maybe even a Zoom call, to look at things like, oh boy, what am I doing in this visit other than knocking on your door and asking you to blow in this tube to prove you're sober? I have to do a thinking report with you, or looks like we're going to practice a social skill, or again, these other either cognitive behavioral interventions or anything, as you noted, correctional practices. Did you have any experience with that where, again, when you sort of take away those traditional enforcement tools, it left folks that opportunity to practice some of those EBP muscles?
Yeah, I think so. But I also think it's like it made people reflect on what they do, right? It's like you have all this effort in our field to like monitor and sniff, right? I call it the sniff, right? Like, well, people just need to be in the room so I can sniff them. And it's like, what we realize is like, that's actually not true. And I think when you change from ref to coach, ref automatically sets our perspective, right? And so I think the virtual world helped us with this. It automatically set us to this belief that we are against the person. Mm-hmm. We want something different than the person on supervision. We want a different path. They're fighting us for it. They're fighting us for their old behavior. And we're trying to get them to change to this new behavior that the judge has ordered them to behave in and that we agree is pro-social. And the reality is, I think what people started to recognize, more so than not, was that the people that are on supervision are humans. And it's funny to say this, and I know it sounds ironic, and we'll probably spend like 8 minutes more on this, but is that when you're in their physical space and they show up and they walk in your door and they show up at X time and you see them and you have a plan for 15 minutes, I'm going to tell them about this. I'm going to go over the conditions and answer have you committed any new crime the last time I sent you, right? Instead of that regimen, right, where we almost lose the fact that they're a human being that's working and moving in and out of space. I think the pandemic made us realize that they're human. Right? People started to be worried about health. And I'm a big proponent on the R&R model, right? Like our role in corrections or probation is to help people reduce their likelihood of engaging in crime. But there is a hierarchy. There is a Pavlov's kind of, or not Pavlov, but
Maslow.
Maslow, thank you. Other psychologists. There's a Maslow hierarchy. Like health is important. And I think what happened was we leaned in. And we realize that we're not much different as human beings than the people on supervision. I'm not saying like their behavior isn't, antisocial or that we're antisocial. But what I'm saying is, right, is that like the people on supervision have lives. They have family. They have the same risks of health scares as we do. And I think what happened was when we entered their life in a different way, when now we're connected through the video, we see their house. We see their family in a different light. We see the struggles. And we have some more compassion on Like, we're trying to do our work. Well, kids are running around and dogs are barking, which, by the way, you'll probably hear mine, or I have 3 boys, so they'll probably join the podcast at some point. Right? But imagine, right? Like, we finally got involved. And what I think was really cool was the feedback. For the first time that I can think of in the last 30 years I've been in this field, that we actually got people routinely coming back and saying this was helpful. Routinely coming back and saying, you know what? I really appreciated that you were there for me. Like, my family was sick and you didn't make me come in. Or I was able to not have to try to figure out how to navigate my job and see you at 2:00. And it's hard enough already. And this made it a lot easier to be part of this.
Yeah. Yes to everything you just said. And agreed. I think it really forced the practitioner to look at the value added of that traditional field visit or that traditional office visit. If it was just a visit for the sake of a visit to write down face-to-face visit or whatever. And to your other point, it really, again, boosted that empathy, because it was this, I'm going through the same struggles as you are with COVID or with how this affects my family. And again, it added to that humanization. When you were speaking earlier of Dr. Latessa, and you gave the story of how, if he said, hey, stand on your head, it reduces recidivism, that's what we're going to do. I could relate, because in my career trajectory, and I've been doing this for about 33 years, I moved from that, like you said, criminal justice master's degree, started my career with the Florida Department of Correction, so very law enforcement, and then fell in love with evidence-based practice. And I would say the same type of thing. I'm not married to anything, but if the research shows there's a decent effect size, that's what we're going to go with. We talk a lot about those interventions on the show, talk a lot about the risk needs responsivity framework, but as you're aware, we also like to highlight components of the emerging desistance models. I used to have it saved on my favorites. It was a YouTube clip of Dr. Latessa. I forget where he was speaking, but he was essentially going through, and I know you've heard it ad nauseum, his correctional quackery speech. But again, the more that I speak to those thought leaders in the desistance camp, I think, okay, if I were to be so rigid with Dr. Latessa's correctional quackery doctrine, if you will, I wouldn't consider things like hope or identity or, again, the myriad of things that we find in the desistance literature that don't jive with the R&R framework. What are your thoughts as to the coexistence, if you will, of these two approaches?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. And I appreciate evolution, right? Like, what I say today does not look like what I said 2 years ago, 4 years ago, 20 years ago. So I was part of the team that developed the Ohio Risk Assessment System and the Ohio Youth Assessment System. And I tell people all the time, like, look, evolutionary thinking brings us to a different space than we were 10 years ago when we developed those tools. I would not have written the outcomes, right? I would have done the same, probably similar study, similar data collection process that we did with the OEAs. We went out and interviewed prospectively kids and asked all sorts of range of questions, both protective and risk factors, if you will. But what we did was we formulated all those into low, moderate, and high risk. And to be honest, I would write it the opposite these days. I would say, you know what? This is a high success. This is a youth who is high likely to be successful. This is one who's medium likely and low likely without intervention. Because I think it reframes, right? I talk to staff all the time or judges, and I'm like, look, that person only has an 8% chance of reoffending, like, or people that look like him or they have an 8% chance of reoffending. And they're like, yeah, but when I flip it and I say, you know what, they have a 92% chance of being successful without intervention. They're like, well, then why are we doing something with them? Like, they want to fix the 8%, but they don't see it in the opposite direction. So first off, I think we need to change the core language. We need to change it from risk to something else that's, and maybe desistance. But I find that that's even hard for people to wrap their head around. Like, it's like we got to target the right people, right? We got to stay out of the way of the wrong people. I think that works well in both models. Because what we don't want people with good intentions and sort of this systems model and how do we help people move forward. Like, we want to let people move forward on their own if they can do it on their own. And that's what I appreciate in the risk principle is like, at least it tells us that these people we should leave alone. We're not very good at that, but
we're not.
But we're okay. I think that I like this concept though of like an integrated model that understands the risks. But what I'm starting to believe is that it's how we talk to people and how we interact with the people, right? So I was working with this group that writes curriculum, and they wanted to write it for the person on supervision or the person in the correction system, but they wanted to use academic jargon so that the people, right? It's like this self-report, like journaling kind of thing. But the people that are going to buy it are correctional workers or administrators who want to see the language. So we need criminal attitudes. We need risk factors. We need all this. And I'm like, so let me make sure I understand. We're trying to build this relationship with the client, and we're going to call them antisocial. We're going to tell them they have antisocial attitudes, and that we think they're going to keep reading. Like, it's almost like we've got to frame. It's like the risk assessment. I still think it's an incredibly important tool to know what are the factors that are likely to keep people engaged in the criminal justice system. But I don't think we should be having conversations with people about their high risk. I think our conversation should be, how do we help you become successful? And let's look at your strengths, right? And I know that the plan is to use their strengths to connect to this, and I can't ignore the negatives or ignore the risk factors, but I don't have to produce them to them and give them a list and say, you're high risk here. It is interesting, though, real quick, sorry, and that the risk, there is some unpacking risk in the medical field and like risk translation in the medical field. And they actually find that telling people that they are high risk for heart attacks or high risk for X has some benefit. And so it's like this tough balance between like labeling theory, which I actually believe is probably one of the more predictive kind of criminological theories that we have, right? But labeling theory, and that I think the difference is when we think of medical field, we think of this transient thing that happens to us, right? We're high risk for a heart attack. It's not because we're high risk people, but it's because we have some behaviors that are, and in corrections, we train them as they're high risk people. And it becomes who they are and defines who they are. Instead of, look, you have some characteristics that are likely to get you in trouble, but you have a lot of characteristics that are actually you can build off of and be supportive.
You mentioned your experience with risk assessment, and I was relating, I'm a master trainer of the LSCMI, which is just another criminogenic risk assessment. But to your point about how we talk about the assessment, particularly with our clients, I was just doing some training around what we call normative feedback, but it's essentially, how do you present the results of this assessment back to your client? And I challenged the trainers or the users, try to do this without using the word risk. Because as you said, that's so toxic. And I'm going to totally steal what you said about flipping it upside down and saying, you're not 70% risk, you're 30% to succeed in this area or whatnot.
And here's the thing. Sorry, go, Joe. Sorry, I keep cutting you off.
No, that's okay. Before I lose my train of thought, you were talking about analogies in the medical field, which I use those analogies all the time because I just think folks can relate to them. And to your point about calling somebody high risk for heart attack, yes, if we use that language to jar their cognitive dissonance, to address some of that ambivalence around change, that's fine. If my doctor tells me that I am at risk of prediabetes because of all the crap I eat and my age, I'm in a bucket of other people who are going to get it. That's different, again, than saying, Joe, you're a bad person because you eat a handful of M&Ms before you go to bed every night. I don't actually do that.
Fair enough. Maybe during Halloween.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate it. And I'm passionate. I know you are as well. So I keep cutting you off. So I'm sorry. But I think we have this NIC project that we got recently at Justice System Partners JSP. That is, they put it out as what are these indicating? What are these videos? These sort of self-help how-to videos around core correctional practice. And one of the things I worked with them on over the last couple months since we got it was the field doesn't need another video of how to deliver avoiding trouble with others, right? Or problem solving, right? We have a 3-step problem solving, a 5-step, a 4-step, a 29-step, complicated as hell, not so complicated. Right? What we need is the precursor and the post-interaction support, like how to, right? So the first one we filmed was how to set up an assessment with a person. And it's 3 minutes, and it's this juxtaposition of how we normally do it. And then imagine if we could interact with someone in a different way. And what we presented was basically like telling someone, look, Joe, I'm really excited that you're here today because it's incredibly important that I learn about you and I understand what kind of drives your boat, right? Like where you're headed. And so my goal is to help you be successful and the most successful as I possibly can. And the only way I know how to do that is to help understand or help you inform me or help me understand what makes you tick, right? And it's this conversation about like, imagine if we told people we're excited to learn about them, right? That's what we don't get trained. We get trained in the technical skills, but here's how you apply the scoring guide. Here's how you follow it. Here's how you do it with fidelity. But often we don't get trained in the context of delivering the evidence-based practice, really, or the core correctional practice, just the content of it. And what you said earlier, I thought really, that's why I tried to jump in on you, was because it really struck a chord with me is that it's where R&R falls short is it assumes exactly what Ed said. If standing on your head works, then I'm going to just tell people to stand on your head. And it's not a recognition that I just said to you, what you've invested your entire life on is garbage, or he would use horseshit, is horseshit, and they just changed. And then he doesn't understand why overnight they wouldn't just say, okay, I'm not going to do X, I'm going to do Y because that's what the data shows. And what I believe is that we have to couch all of this in the fact that we're people. And that the people on supervision are people. And they got all sorts of things going on in their life, and we're just one component of it. And that they're awesome people who engage in criminal behavior, not terrible people who happen to engage in criminal behavior. And when we think of them that way, we start to think about, okay, where can we get them to expand those good behaviors? How do we help minimize and reduce the number of behaviors that are problematic? Right? Because many of these are learned processes, right? They're adjustments or they're ways that we adjust with our lives. It's like using violence. Like it works as an indicator, works as a mechanism to get someone to do what I want. There's just horrible consequences for it.
Yeah, when I give my sort of armchair definition at 10,000 feet, distinguishing between the risk needs responsivity framework and the desistance approach, I say, R&R, for the most part, looks at those pathways into crime, and desistance looks at those pathways out of crime. But to your point, Brian, again, we've gotten really good in R&R world of isolating those primary, the central 8 pathways into crime without acknowledging that those pathways out, some are the same, employment, social support, but some are different. There's a myriad of different ways out. And again, we got, to our credit, because we weren't doing it before the battle days of Robert Martinson, great first start looking at those pathways into crime. But let's take a more holistic approach and acknowledge that it's one thing to extinguish those pathways in, but we've also got to augment those pathways out. And the two are not mutually exclusive. It's not Coke and Pepsi.
Great. And I'll tell you where I think your point is starting to be centered even more is on pretrial assessment and pretrial supervision or pretrial services, right? So historically, we've taken an assessment like the PSA or the ORAS or the VPRE or whatever pretrial tool you have. And what does it measure? It measures your past criminal history associated with failure, right? So it says, there isn't a pretrial tool in the nation that doesn't look at failure to appear as one of the predictors, right? Not surprising, right? Prior failure to appear produces future failures to appear. The problem is that there's not a single tool that measures FTAs that tells the officer or tells the person in supervision or in services or the judge even, hey, by the way, what caused them to fail was child support. No, not child support money, but support for monitoring your children. Or what caused them to fail is they have a hourly point job, and if they miss 2 or more points, they're going to lose their job. And so they couldn't leave their work and come to court. Right? So the problem is we try to address failure to appear by only knowing that they have a prior failure to appear. And that's not the pathway out. That's the pathway in. The pathway out is a social service assessment. So we actually are working on one in Illinois right now where we're collecting, or will be when we get to that phase, collecting social support data, right? What is likely to impact your ability to show back up to court? And we're asking the person that's in the court process, like, what is it in your life that's going to make this hard? And it may be that they don't want to get the consequence and that they're avoiding the punishment and they're hoping it falls apart before they ever show up to court. Or it may be that they just didn't have a ride. Or maybe, and we know from the only thing that's ever shown to be effective with pretrial is text messaging reminder that, surprise, surprise, they're like all the rest of the human beings in the world, and they got a lot of stuff going on, and they may just need a reminder that tomorrow is the day you come to court. Right? I would miss every dental appointment that I've ever had if I didn't get a reminder from the dentist, right? Like, and I'm pretty well organized. I even have a calendar reminder for when I have to pick my kids up because I'll get into this kind of stuff and then I'll get a text like, "Where the hell are you, Dad?" And so I think you're right on. Like, and we're starting to see this. We're not getting pretrial supervision departments anymore. We're getting pretrial service departments. And what can pretrial departments do to help pathways forward for people to be successful? Not what can we do to monitor their past criminal behavior, right? So get rid of electronic monitoring. Electronic monitoring helps no one show back up to court. And the only reason that it works for catching people or for engaging in criminal behaviors, we catch them before they cut it off or they wear it when they commit the crime. Right? The reality is we need social service agencies to service people that are on pretrial to help them show back up to court and hopefully stay out of trouble before they get through the process.
I so appreciate your dynamic, to coin a phrase, way of thinking about these established evidence-based practices. I feel sometimes that, ironically, the states or jurisdictions that are more progressive, if you will, with evidence-based practices, you know how now we train on not just risk, need, responsivity, but also fidelity. But we sometimes get so hung up on that fidelity piece that we don't see that balance of what we've just been talking about here, that individualizing piece.
Oh, it drives me nuts. I honestly wish that wasn't one of the principles that they shape, because I find, like, imagine, right? I have colleagues who train on curriculum, right? And you've done this before. And they're like, read the curriculum to the person. So we're supposed to take moderate to high-risk people and read Thinking for a Change directly to them. Like, I can imagine that conversation looks something like this. All right, thank you all for coming to group today. look up and make eye contact and smile. Right? Like, no one's engaged in that. No one's going to sit there and have someone read to them. My 6-year-old doesn't even like me reading to him anymore. How completely patronizing and patriarchal it is to sit there and read to someone and think that they're going to engage, right? Like, that's where fidelity's gotten us. And the reason why is this. Because what I would argue, and I know this is on our conversation list, is where we're shifting. What I found was that we have more coaches than we have referees in corrections, right? So every research study we've done so far, every survey we've done, we found that staff self-identify as coaches more often than referees, right? And if you think about it, people get in this field because they want to make a difference. Not surprising. What we found was 80% of those people said that the job, the structure of their employment blocks them from being a coach. 80% said it interferes with them delivering coach-like activities. And I'll tell you what, it's wrapped around this fidelity model. It's wrapped around this we've got to create policy to make a floor. And so I ask people all the time, I say, Joe, so do you honor and respect the fact that interventions should be individualized?
Yes.
And most people say, yeah, right? So let me look at your policy. Your policy says that every single high-risk person, right, because we still use that language, even though, again, every person with limited or minimal success without support, every single person that's high risk needs 4 contacts, 2 in person, 1 collateral, and 1 at home. I'm like, well, what's individualized about that? What I call them? Their name? Like, the only thing that's individualized is I go to a different address. Like, the policy should be written from a different perspective. The policy should be written, the person who knows this person best is the person on supervision, their support people, the probation coach, and their supervisor. And that they should develop a plan that's individualized for that person to be the best, most successful that they possibly can. An organization should be designed, which they're not right now, but we're trying to push them there. Organization should be designed to create that space between coach and person on supervision so that that relationship can be the best it can be, so that the staff can do their best work and that the person on supervision can have the greatest likelihood of being successful. And everything within our organization of probation, parole, community corrections, prisons, every policy, every relationship, every practice, even the physical environment should be set up to maximize the relationship between the person on supervision and the coach so that they can create a successful space. And right now, we apply out to in. We make sure that the system is set up. We organize it. We create reports that no one ever reads. We collect data no one ever looks at or uses. And then we say, here's all your work. And by the way, while you're in there, do some of this core correctional practice stuff.
We are kindred spirits, Brian. I have literally used that same example with the Thinking for a Change curricula. All due respect to our friends at NIC, but you're right. It says right there, if you must, read this word for word. And I mean, I'm savvy enough that I can read the room, and when half the folks aren't relating to it, call an audible, Joe, and change up this scenario because they're not getting it. Again, responsivity. And my theory was always, and I'm really getting off topic here, but we're not putting enough into the trainer. If they've got to be so, we've built in this almost robotic safety net of, if nothing else, just get up there and parrot what we wrote. I have done a lot of curriculum rewrites, again, around assessment, and I go out of my way to infuse what we've been talking about today. How R&R rests on the shoulders of strain theory, labeling theory, differential association theory. And I always tell my trainers, my facilitators in the making, if you understand the theoretical underpinnings of this, you don't have to memorize how I do this in a teach back or a role play. You'll be able to call those aforementioned audibles based on your client because you can interpret it. And again, we're just sort of creating these these clones, but if the clones are only programmed for one type of client, we're hamstringing them to call that audible. Yeah.
Yeah, they understand how to deliver the curriculum. They don't understand the theory behind and underneath, right? So cognitive behavioral interventions, right? One of the more successful practices that help change behavior, right? It drives behavior. Thinking drives action. Action has consequences. Consequences inform behavior. Right? Yet when I talk to people who deliver T for C, they don't understand that. They think that it's the curriculum. It's like, no, it's look at Lipsky's work. He found clearly that the name of the curriculum doesn't matter. The brand name doesn't matter. It's that, is it fundamentally based on cognitive behavioral interventions? Like, you don't even need I hate to say this, but the fidelity people go nuts, but you don't need a curriculum to deliver CBI, right? Now, the problem is you need to be trained in CBI, not in the curriculum. And that's where I think we fall short.
Yeah, I was going to cut you off there again and say, look at the work that came out of all of the STIX research, thanks to Jim Bonta and Guy Burgon around. It was really, if you can get your client, the single most important thing, if you can get your client to understand the thought behavior link, then bam, you've achieved COG. And to that end, and I did a whole episode just highlighting this, but if none of you listening have heard it, go back and listen to my episode on Spot the Dog. Speaking of calling an audible, because one of Guy's disciples came up with this analogy of, well, most folks have trained a dog or are aware of that process, and that's very relatable. But they did this to illustrate the thought behavior link, and it resonated with the clients better than some scripted one size fits all approach. And it took off from there. But beyond that, and I've talked to Guy about this, is it doesn't matter if it's training a dog or what. If you can just train your staff to understand the thought behavior link, and then they can customize it as they want. But to your point, we're not doing that. We're doing it sort of off the shelf, and then you've got to make this off the shelf product fit your individual client.
And I believe the reason why is because we have a very hierarchical top-down model. So if you look at Brandon Matthews' dissertation, for example, in organizational culture, organizational change, he talks about what he found was across fields, agencies or organizations that implement evidence-based practice that are authoritative do a terrible job. It's not until you're in an autocracy or a clan-like environment where you have this center out, where the people who are delivering the interventions are the ones who are creating and being curious and developing the practices that drive it. Right? The problem is we have this sort of like, we must tell people on the line what to do. And so we write this policy, give them a curriculum, because God forbid they talk about something because they can't stay on topic in a session. Well, they won't focus on CBT, so we got to tell them exactly what to. I'm like, if I read one more skilled delivery set, it's like, really, it's all the same shit with a different label at the top. Stop, think, act. Right? Like, oh no, but we have 12 steps to do that.
You mentioned problem solving. I've seen the 3-step problem solving, the 5-step problem solving, the 7-step problem solving. It's crazy.
Yep. And what does it boil down to? It's like, right, evaluate your situation. What's best for you? Try it out and react. Right? Like, but I think that's the problem is I think it's and I don't think it's intentional. I think it's implicit. But it's the same thinking that we just talked about with clients, that the people who are walking in our door don't really want to change, that we're forcing them to. So when we have that lens, we think of them as people who are in denial. We think of them as people who are resistant, people who don't want to do what we want to do. And our job is to track them down and find where they're not doing what we want to do. I believe that every person who walks in my door when I was in Harris, I believe that every single one of them wanted a different life. They all wanted something different and better in their life than what they got right now. And that our job was to help shepherd that through. Right? I think the same thing's true as we move up from line staff to mid-manager to manager to director. I think what happens is we think about, well, we got to tell them what to do because they don't really want to do anything. They don't want to help the person. And the reality is, we're going to invest in them. I used to hire people, and we'd ask one question during the interview, the first round. Do you believe people can change? And if we got some hem-haw answer, oh, yeah, under certain circumstances, well, the sex offenders can't, but the other ones can, we wouldn't hire you. I don't care how many probation departments you worked for, how many times you were trained in court correctional practice. We're not hiring you if you don't believe that people can change. And I think that's a core component of the work we do, is that we have to believe that the people we're working with are worth our time and our investment. And then all this stuff is like bonus, right? Like, it's like, I laugh all the time. I'm like, what do you mean you have change fatigue? Like, could you imagine your doctor said, yeah, the last time I went to a training and got better at my job was 1986 because I was just a little too tired of learning these new technologies. Like, we wouldn't accept that in any other profession, yet we hear it all the time in our world. You hear it all the time, like, oh, hold on, I don't want to learn anything new that might help my people get even better. And the reason why, go back to the ref coach. Refs don't like the rules to change because then they have to learn a different rule book, call different plays, learn a different practice, and learn the penalty that goes around with it. Coaches, I get done teaching my 12-year-old baseball drills, or I coach this team. I get done, I come home, and for the next hour and a half, I'm Googling, like, how do I teach a kid who's swinging late? What are the drills I can use to help them swing earlier? What's the drill I can use to help them figure out a game to do relays? And then I implement that, and I test it and see if it helps them improve. Imagine if we turned probation officers on to say, look, your job is to figure out how they hit this fastball. We know you got to hit the fastball, so how you do it, and your job is to figure out how to do that in their life.
I love that interview question, that singular question you asked. It reminds me of something that I've been yelling from the mountaintops at hiring managers as long as I can remember, but it's hire to the will, train to the skill. If you get that client-centered, that empathy, hire to that. And I can train up whoever you hire on these core correctional practices. But to your point, we tend to do it backwards and look at their resume and see all the certificates they have, many of which I would contend they got just so they could get a promotion. But we're not hiring to the will. Yeah.
I'll add one other one. Write policies to good staff and not the bad ones. Supervise the bad ones or the ones that aren't doing their job, and write policies so the good ones can do great work. And that's an incredibly important. I see too many agencies writing policies to create the floor and not the ceiling.
100%. I don't want to let you out of here. You referenced it earlier, the latest chapter in your life. Talk about JSP for a little bit.
Yeah, it's a cool organization. It was I left Harris, was looking to. I felt like I was in Harris almost a little over 7 years, and I felt like sort of got this model down and an opportunity to really think bigger than a single agency, right? And they were in good hands. We had really good infrastructure we'd built around, and so I took the dive to go back out into the field, or back out into to technical assistance research. My role in Harris was not a research position. And at the end of the day, like, I want to learn and help people do better things. And so Justice System Partners has been around for about now a little over 8 years. We're small. We have 11 staff. We're growing a little bit more recently. But we have a cool array of practical projects. What we envision or what we see ourselves is a group of people who are, most of us have experience working in the system. We believe that for system transformation to work, it's better from inside the 10 out than outside the 10 in. And that's not always the model, and I understand that, and I understand where people stand. But I think for me, always having a better sense of what's inside and working outwards always seems to be more practical and more effective. But on the other hand, systems and agencies are set up to maintain status quo. So you've got to know where you can push people. But JSP's done, we have a cool range. We have some technical assistance projects within IC where we're designing and developing training for supervisors and emerging leaders. We have a cool study on looking at the reductions through Arnold Ventures, looking at the reductions of conditions. And then on one site, and the second site, we're actually redesigning the conditions to be change-oriented. So we're changing the language that is presented to the people on supervision to say, look, our job here is to help you not be perfect when you start, but to be in a better place when you're done. And and we're going to see, does it increase engagement? Does someone going from 19 conditions to 7 matter? And then going from 19 to 7 and rewriting those 7 to be things like, look, the expectation is that you remain sober. If you struggle with that, get into contact with your probation officer, and their job is to help you get connected with better services and support you through sobriety. Right? That's the condition, instead of do not use drugs, do not possess, blah, blah, blah. Right? In a hope that if you do test positive, you come back. Because everyone in the system agrees someone should not be revoked to prison because they test positive to drugs. But what happens is they leave, they run, they stop coming because they're worried about that. And no one would have put them in prison in the first place. And so why don't we be honest with people on supervision, right? So we have a cool study there. We just finished up a revocation challenge in Harris, looking at what are the drivers. And one of the things that we continue to push that I know you and your audience would love is like, look, we can look at the drivers, but that's not really the interest. It's how do we get people through the system in a way that doesn't create failure? Right? I used to tell staff at Harris, like doing a final review of someone who's already gone down the path and failing. We learn CPR, we can redo it, but their heart's already damaged. What's the point? Like, shouldn't we be finding the things on the front end of the system that we can set up and design and develop better so that we're not in the place of having to revive them? And then what happens often is, in our thinking, we teach CPR here, and then we say, okay, well, let's apply it here. And it's like, well, they don't need CPR at the beginning. They need some other interventions. And so really thinking about how do we shape the future. And so we've got an upcoming project with Harris on redesigning how probation officers work with people on supervision to be more coach-like, but also in what space does that look like? So we're going to create some community-based kind of labs, if you will, or these physical spaces that are in strip malls and the communities people live in, and they're more like social service connections and getting people linked, somewhat like New York City's sort of their community service probation sites. And so really excited about that project. And then we help shepherd through the Safety Justice Challenge and the MacArthur Grant, MacArthur Foundation, the Safety Justice Challenge on reducing jail population, specifically through a lens around diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And so how do we disrupt the system and where we've been disparate? How do we create a more equitable space for people of color and women? So excited about that work as well.
A lot of exciting work you've got going on there. I will leave a link for JSP again in the show notes of this episode. So if folks want to learn more, I would encourage them to do so. You're going to have to come back, Brian. I had to cut myself off because I had the feeling you and I could have talked all night long, but I appreciate you giving us these great insights. And again, I would love to have you back to talk more, maybe this time specifically about some of those Justum system partners that you just teased us with there.
Awesome. I'd love to. I appreciate the time. And like I said, I dig into the podcast of yours and think it's incredibly important to talk to people who are working in the space. And I think you do a great job of that. So I really appreciate you inviting me.
I appreciate that. Heavy duty affirmation, as we would say. I sincerely do. All right, Brian, until next time, be well.
Awesome. And thank you guys for joining the podcast and look forward to talking to you in the future.
Huge thank you once again to Brian Lovins for sharing his experience and insights with us. So much I could reflect on and attempt to unpack. I sincerely hope Brian will join us again on the show at some future point. I have left a link for Justice System Partners, his latest venture, in the show notes of this episode. Additionally, I have also left a link for the article that we spent so much time discussing, Probation Officer as Coach, Building a New Professional Identity. Again, that article originally appeared in Federal Probation Journal. You can access it by looking at the description of this episode. We will be back next week with a fresh episode. Some heavy hitters coming up. Scheduled guests include the one and only Dr. James Bonta will be joining the podcast. So if you got your risk-need responsivity groove on with this episode, you're really going to want to listen for the Jim Bonta interview scheduled in the next couple of weeks. Also, from the world of implementation science, the lovely Dr. Alex Walker will be joining us from ACJI, our friends out in Denver, Colorado. So a couple of fantastic guests coming up in the next 2 weeks. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, the Paragon Group, LLC.com, for training or presentations as to evidence-based practices or implementation, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook page and our Instagram page at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. We're also on Twitter, the Criminologist Media Group. You can follow us at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. Go ahead and give us a follow. You can also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. Hey, merchandise is now available. Reach out if you'd like to get some cool swag. And if you believe what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word. Tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the show as well. And of course, do so yourself if you've already not done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
Well, it's good to find out that you were the other person than my mom to read the article. So I was always looking for the second person, but could never really tie them down. So I really appreciate that.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.
The thoughts, statements, and opinions of the host and cast members do not necessarily reflect the views of their employers and are those of the host and cast themselves. Any discussion regarding client statements, behaviors, actions, or crimes are purely fictional and are used only for the purposes of example. Any examples that could be deemed to be related to an actual individual or individuals are incidental.